I never imagined that a snowstorm would become the dividing line between the life I thought I wanted and the one I couldn't stop thinking about afterward. If you'd asked me a week earlier what I thought about my boss, I would have given you the safest answer possible. Russell was demanding. Calm. Impossible to read. The kind of manager who never raised his voice because he never had to. One quiet sentence from him carried more weight than someone else yelling for 10 minutes. Everyone in the office respected him. Some people feared him. I mostly tried to stay out of his way. Not because he was cruel. Because I wanted his approval far more than I wanted to admit. I'd only been with the company for 8 months, and at 26, I was still trying to prove that hiring me hadn't been a mistake. Every project felt like a test. Every meeting felt like another chance to disappoint someone. Russell never made that easier. If I did something well, he'd nod once. If this is the standard now, keep it there. That was his version of praise. The first time I heard him say, "Good work," I honestly thought I'd misheard him. The office liked to joke that Russell smiled twice a year. Once at Christmas. Once by accident. I wasn't sure I'd ever seen either. So when he stopped beside my desk late on a Thursday afternoon, I immediately assumed I'd done something wrong. "You still have the Carson proposal?" I looked up from my monitor. "Yeah. Bring it to conference room B." Then he walked away before I could ask why. That was Russell. No wasted words. No unnecessary explanations. I grabbed my laptop and followed him down the hallway, already replaying the presentation in my head, searching for mistakes. Conference room B overlooked the parking lot, where thick gray clouds had already swallowed the afternoon sun. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the windows. Someone from accounting walked by and laughed. "They're saying we could get 12 inches tonight." Nobody looked concerned. It was January. Weather reports loved exaggerating. Russell was already sitting at the far end of the table when I walked in. His suit jacket rested over the back of his chair, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. Without the jacket, he looked less intimidating. Still intimidating. Just slightly more human. "Sit." I did. He opened the proposal. For almost 40 minutes we went through every page together. He questioned numbers. Suggested changes. Pointed out 3 mistakes I'd completely missed. None of it felt personal. He wasn't trying to make me feel stupid. He simply expected better. When we finished, I closed my laptop with a sigh. "I'll fix everything tonight." "You don't have to." I blinked. "I don't?" He shook his head. "Tomorrow morning is fine." I stared at him for a second. Had Russell just told me to go home? He noticed my confusion. "You look surprised." "I am." A corner of his mouth almost moved. "I don't enjoy making people work late." That tiny sentence completely destroyed the image I'd built of him. Apparently, the office myths weren't entirely accurate. As we left the conference room together, phones around the office started buzzing almost at once. Emergency weather alerts. Outside, the snow wasn't drifting anymore. It was falling sideways. Within minutes, people began packing their bags. Someone yelled across the office. "They're shutting down the highway." Another voice answered. "The airport just canceled everything." Our receptionist was already putting on her coat. "I'm leaving before I get trapped here." Within 10 minutes, half the office had disappeared. Russell stood near the windows, watching the storm build. It looked different now. The parking lot had vanished beneath a sheet of white. Wind slammed against the glass. Streetlights turned on hours before sunset. I checked my phone. Every weather app showed the same headline. Historic blizzard warning. Avoid travel. I looked toward Russell. So, he agreed. Neither of us moved. Then every light in the building flickered. Once. Twice. Someone somewhere muttered, "That's not good." The power stayed on. Barely. Russell pulled out his phone. No signal. I checked mine. Nothing. The office suddenly felt much quieter. Almost everyone had already left. Only 4 of us remained. Facilities. Security. Russell. Me. The facilities manager appeared around the corner wearing a heavy winter coat. They've closed every road out of downtown. He looked apologetic. You guys might be here for a while. I laughed. He didn't. You serious? He nodded. Emergency services are telling everyone to stay indoors. Silence settled over the room. Russell glanced outside once more. I'll call the building owner. No signal, the facilities manager reminded him. Right. Another gust of wind shook the windows. The building groaned softly. For the first time since I'd met Russell. He looked uncertain. Not scared. Just aware that this wasn't something he could solve with another meeting or another spreadsheet. He looked at me. I suppose our evening just changed. I managed a weak smile. I guess we're snowed in. He looked toward the blizzard swallowing the city. Looks that way. At that moment, neither of us had any idea that the next 24 hours would completely change how I saw him. Or how he saw me. Russell handled uncertainty the same way he handled everything else. Quietly. No pacing. No complaining. No dramatic phone calls that couldn't go through anyway. He simply assessed the situation, rolled his sleeves back down, picked up his jacket, and said, Let's see what we're working with. The facilities manager led us through the mostly empty building. Emergency generators had kicked in, but only essential systems were running. Half the lights were off. The heating worked, though not at full power. The cafeteria still has electricity, he explained. Coffee machines too. That sounded strangely comforting. We've got blankets stored downstairs in case employees ever get stuck here overnight. Russell raised an eyebrow. So this has happened before? Not like this. The man glanced toward the windows. This storm's different. By 6 o'clock, the building felt enormous. Without hundreds of employees talking, printers humming, phones ringing, every hallway echoed. It reminded me of visiting my elementary school during summer vacation. The same place. Completely different feeling. Security locked the front entrance and wished us luck before disappearing into the lobby. Apparently, he had his own office with a backup cot. Lucky him. Russell and I carried 2 folded blankets upstairs into the executive lounge. It wasn't fancy. Just quieter than the open office. A leather couch. 2 armchairs. A television that no longer had a signal. Large windows overlooking nothing but swirling white. Russell placed the blankets on one chair. I've spent enough nights in airports. I looked at him. You have? More than I'd recommend. I would have guessed you liked traveling. I like arriving. That caught me off guard. He noticed. What? I don't know. I smiled. I guess I never imagined you making jokes. I wasn't aware I'd made one. You did. A faint smile appeared. Tiny. Gone almost immediately. Still. It was there. That felt strangely satisfying. We wandered down to the cafeteria, where the emergency lighting cast everything in soft yellow shadows. The refrigerators still hummed. Coffee was still available. Someone had left an unopened box of granola bars near the register. Russell inspected the shelves like he was evaluating inventory. This could be worse. It definitely could. I grabbed 2 coffees. When I handed him one, he hesitated. I'll pay you back. I laughed. It's office coffee. I still owe you. I promise we're even. He accepted it anyway. Thank you? For someone who spoke so little. His thank you sounded surprisingly genuine. We sat near the windows. Outside, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Cars abandoned in the parking lot were becoming smooth white hills. So, I stirred my coffee. Can I ask you something? Russell looked up. You just did. I rolled my eyes. There it is again. What? The jokes. I'm beginning to think you simply have low standards. I laughed louder than I'd expected. The sound echoed through the empty cafeteria. Russell looked almost surprised by it. What? I don't think I've ever laughed around you. That seems unlikely. I mean, really laughed. He leaned back. I'm apparently improving. There it was again. Dry. Almost invisible. But definitely humor. I'd spent 8 months convinced this man had been assembled entirely from spreadsheets and black coffee. Maybe everyone in the office had. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. Just calm. Eventually he asked, "How old are you, Dean?" 26. He nodded. I started managing people when I was 27. That genuinely surprised me. I thought you were older. I'll decide whether that's an insult. It's absolutely an insult. Another tiny smile. You recovered quickly. I tried. He took another sip of coffee. I was terrible at it. Managing? He nodded. I assumed everyone learned the way I did. And they didn't. They did not. That admission felt unexpectedly honest. I'd never imagined Russell admitting weakness of any kind. I probably wasn't much fun to work for. Were? He looked at me over the rim of his cup. You think I've stopped? I couldn't help smiling. No comment. Wise choice. Outside, the wind slammed against the building again. The lights flickered. This time they stayed dim for several seconds before stabilizing. Neither of us spoke. The storm somehow felt louder now. Like it wanted us to remember it was still there. After another hour, boredom began settling in. No internet. No phone signal. No television. Nothing to distract us except conversation. Which was unfortunate. Because conversation with my boss wasn't exactly a skill I'd mastered. Russell solved the problem before I could. What did you do before this job? I blinked. You mean professionally? No. His expression remained perfectly straight. I assumed you emerged fully grown with a business degree. I laughed. You really do have jokes. So you've mentioned. I leaned back. I worked at a bookstore during college. You liked it? I loved it. What changed? Student loans. He nodded slowly. Understandable. What about you? I started in consulting. I know that. I hated it. That stopped me. You hated it? It paid well. That's not the same thing. No. He looked toward the storm again. It isn't. The room fell quiet once more. I found myself studying him when he wasn't looking. Without the office around him. Without meetings. Without deadlines. Russell looked different. Still composed. Still confident. But also tired. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes I'd never noticed before. His tie was gone. The top button of his shirt was undone. He looked less like the boss. More like just another man unexpectedly trapped inside a building during the biggest snowstorm of the decade. He caught me looking. What? I looked away immediately. Nothing. I don't believe you. I sighed. You seem. I searched for the word. Different. Inconveniently trapped? No. I smiled. Human. For a second, he didn't answer. Then he looked out at the storm. I'll take that as a compliment. It was. Another long silence. Comfortable this time. The kind that surprised me. Because if someone had told me that morning I'd spend the evening drinking coffee with Russell in an empty office building, I'd have expected tension. Awkwardness. Instead, I was beginning to forget he was my boss at all. And somehow, that realization scared me more than the storm outside. Around 9 that evening, the heating started struggling. Not enough to become dangerous. Just enough that the warmth slowly disappeared from the room. Russell stood and walked toward the thermostat. It can't keep up. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup. I noticed. He looked around the lounge before disappearing into the hallway. Stay here. Where are you going? I saw another storage room. 5 minutes later he returned carrying 3 more blankets. I underestimated how cold commercial buildings become overnight. You planned ahead? I dislike being uncomfortable. That sounds like you. I'll choose to believe that wasn't criticism. It wasn't. He handed me one of the thicker blankets. Our fingers brushed for barely a second. Completely accidental. Still, something about spending hours alone with one person made even ordinary moments feel oddly noticeable. I quickly looked away. Russell didn't seem to react. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I hadn't. Eventually we moved from the cafeteria back into the executive lounge. The couches were more comfortable. The windows somehow made the storm feel less claustrophobic. Snow continued piling against the glass. The city had completely disappeared. It looked like we were floating inside a white cloud. Russell loosened his collar another inch before sitting across from me. You can stop pretending. I frowned. Pretending what? That you're not freezing. I'm fine. You've been rubbing your hands together for 15 minutes. Maybe I'm slightly cold. He tossed another blanket toward me. You'll survive longer with two. You always this practical? Usually. I laughed softly. I've been trying to figure something out. He looked up from his coffee. What? Everyone at work is terrified of you. He considered that. They exaggerate. They absolutely do not. I've never yelled at anyone. You don't need to. He nodded once. Fair. I honestly thought you disliked me for the first month. You were late. Once. You were late 3 times. I stared at him. You remember that? I remember everything. I suddenly understand why people are afraid. I've been told I have a good memory. You have a terrifying memory. A surprisingly genuine laugh escaped him. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just real. I froze. You can laugh. I've always been able to. I've never heard it. I don't usually have reason. That's honestly tragic. He tilted his head. You think so? I do. Silence followed. But this one felt different. More thoughtful. Russell stared into his coffee for several seconds before speaking again. When I first became a manager, his voice had softened. I thought respect came from distance. I listened without interrupting. I watched executives who never shared anything personal. He shrugged slightly. So I copied them. Did it work? Sometimes. And the rest of the time? I became difficult to know. His eyes drifted toward the snow-covered windows. I suppose habits become personalities if you keep them long enough. That sentence stayed with me. Because it didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded lonely. I looked at him differently after that. Not as the executive everyone whispered about. Not as my boss. Just a man sitting across from me in an empty office building while a blizzard raged outside. Someone who had built walls so carefully that even he wasn't sure how to step around them anymore. I realized I'd been staring again. Russell caught me. You've done that twice tonight. What? Looked at me like you're solving a puzzle. I smiled awkwardly. Maybe I am. And I think everyone at work has you completely wrong. His expression barely changed. Or perhaps you're simply seeing a version of me they don't. Why? Because we're trapped together. I don't think that's it. No? I shook my head. I think this is who you are when nobody expects you to be Russell the boss. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then quietly, I haven't heard anyone say something like that in a very long time. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Not physically. Emotionally. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because I'd accidentally crossed into territory neither of us had planned to visit. To escape the seriousness, I stood. I'm going to see if there's anything edible left downstairs. Russell nodded. I'll come with you. The cafeteria was almost eerily quiet. Emergency lights reflected off polished floors. Coffee machines continued humming faithfully. I opened cabinets. Crackers. Another cabinet. Instant noodles. Russell inspected a different shelf. And He held up a plastic container triumphantly. Microwave popcorn. I laughed. That's your victory? It's better than crackers. I can't argue with that. A few minutes later, we sat watching the microwave rotate a single bag of popcorn as if it were evening entertainment. When the popping finally stopped, Russell divided it evenly between two paper bowls. You split it exactly in half. I noticed. Of course you did. He handed me one bowl. We wandered back toward the lounge. Halfway down the hallway, the lights went out. Completely. The emergency generators hesitated. Darkness swallowed everything. For one long second, the only sound was the wind outside. Then instinct took over. Without thinking, I reached forward. My hand found Russell's sleeve. I hadn't meant to grab him. It just happened. A heartbeat later, the emergency lights flickered back to life. Dim red lighting filled the hallway. I immediately let go. Sorry. Russell looked at the place where I'd touched his arm. Then back at me. You don't need to apologize. I wasn't thinking. I know. His voice remained calm. There was nothing inappropriate about it. Still, neither of us started walking again immediately. For just a moment, we stood there under the red emergency lights, the storm roaring outside, looking at each other with an unfamiliar awareness. Then Russell quietly said, I think neither of us expected tonight to be memorable. No. I smiled faintly. I definitely didn't. He held my gaze a second longer than usual. Neither did I. And somehow, those 3 words lingered with me long after we reached the lounge again. Neither of us mentioned what had happened in the hallway. Not because it was embarrassing. Because acknowledging it would have given it more weight than either of us was ready for. By midnight, the building had settled into an almost eerie silence. The storm hadn't weakened. If anything, the wind sounded stronger now, rattling against the windows in long, low waves. Russell stood by the glass with a mug of coffee in one hand. You still can't see the parking lot. I joined him. No. It should be directly below us. Instead, there was only white. An endless curtain of snow illuminated by the emergency lights outside. It almost doesn't feel real, I admitted. No. He folded his arms. It feels like the city disappeared. For several minutes we simply watched the storm. No conversation. No need for one. It amazed me how comfortable the silence had become. Normally, silence between a boss and an employee meant someone had made a mistake. Tonight, it just meant neither of us had anything urgent to say. Eventually Russell spoke. My mother loved storms. I turned toward him. You grew up somewhere cold? Minnesota. That explains a lot. What does it explain? You don't seem impressed by this. I've seen worse. He smiled faintly. Although admittedly not in several years. My parents hated snow. Where'd you grow up? North Carolina. He nodded. So this still feels unusual. I still buy too much bread every time they predict snow. An excellent tradition. I laughed. My neighbors make fun of me. Are they prepared tonight? Probably not. Then you win. I shook my head. You really hide your sense of humor at work. I've been informed. No, seriously. I leaned against the window. If people saw this version of you. This version? The one who's capable of smiling. He looked out at the snow again. I've spent years separating work from everything else. Why? Because it seemed safer. For who? He thought about that. Everyone. I wasn't convinced. I think maybe it was safer for you. He looked at me. There it was again. That thoughtful expression he'd worn several times tonight whenever I accidentally said something that landed a little too close. You asked difficult questions. I didn't mean to. I don't think that's true. I smiled. No? I think you notice more than most people. That surprised me. I usually overthink things. I'm aware. You noticed that too? You apologize before almost every question. I blinked. I do? Can I ask something? This might sound stupid. Sorry if this is weird. His impression was painfully accurate. I didn't realize I did that. I suspect most people don't notice their own habits. I laughed quietly. And you've catalogued mine. I told you. You remember everything. Not everything. What don't you remember? He looked genuinely thoughtful. People's birthdays. Seriously? I forget dates. I stared at him. So the man who remembers every typo I've ever made needs calendar reminders for birthdays. That's strangely reassuring. I'm pleased my flaws have been useful. Again. That dry humor. Again. It made me smile. A little after 1 in the morning, our conversations became more random. Favorite movies. Terrible office coffee. Why the vending machine always $8 bills. Books we'd read. Places we wanted to visit someday. At some point I realized something surprising. Russell asked far more questions than he answered. He genuinely listened. He remembered details. He never interrupted. It was completely different from how meetings worked at the office. There, every conversation had a deadline. Tonight, there wasn't one. Eventually he asked, "So why this company?" I shrugged. It wasn't supposed to be permanent. No. I wanted experience. And now? I hesitated. I actually like it. His eyebrows lifted slightly. I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't either. He looked genuinely curious. What changed? I looked around the quiet executive lounge. I smiled to myself. I realized I like solving problems. He nodded slowly. You're good at it. The compliment landed harder than it should have. Maybe because it was Russell. Maybe because he'd never handed out praise carelessly. I looked down at my coffee. Thank you? I don't give compliments I don't believe. I know. Another silence. This one felt warmer somehow. Outside, the storm still raged. Inside, the building had become strangely peaceful. Around 2 in the morning, I stretched and immediately regretted it. My shoulders ached from sitting all evening. Russell noticed. Back hurting? A little. Walk. What? When I travel too much, I walk. He stood. Otherwise, everything stiffens. So we wandered. Not with any destination. Just empty hallways lit by emergency lights. Past conference rooms. Past rows of silent desks. Past offices that looked strangely abandoned without people inside them. The company felt completely different at night. Almost like it belonged to someone else. As we passed the large reception area, I stopped. The company logo hung on the wall behind the front desk. I remember my interview. Russell looked toward it. I remember it too. You do? You were 20 minutes early. I was terrified. I noticed. You did? You kept reorganizing the magazines. I covered my face. You saw that? I did. I thought nobody noticed. I notice more than people think. I groaned. That's embarrassing. I thought it was thoughtful. I looked at him. You did? You were trying to leave the waiting area nicer than you found it. I blinked. I've never told anyone that. You didn't need to. His voice remained quiet. It told me enough. For some reason. That affected me more than I expected. All this time I'd assumed Russell had remembered my mistakes. Instead, he'd remembered something kind I'd done without realizing anyone had seen it. He continued walking. I stayed where I was for another second, watching him, realizing that maybe I'd misunderstood him from the very beginning. When I caught up, he glanced sideways. What? I smiled. I think you're a lot nicer than you pretend to be. Russell looked ahead again. His answer came almost too softly to hear. Perhaps I'm getting tired of pretending. The words settled between us. Either of us spoke for the rest of the walk. Not because there was nothing to say. Because either of us quite knew what came after a sentence like that. By 3 in the morning, exhaustion had started changing everything. The office no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like an island. The storm outside continued to erase every reminder that the rest of the world still existed. Snow had climbed halfway up the first floor windows, and the city lights had disappeared completely. Russell checked his phone out of habit. Still no signal. He set it back down without comment. I think we've officially stopped pretending we're leaving tonight. I accepted that about 2 hours ago. He nodded. So did I. The heating gave another weak sigh through the vents. Warm enough. Not comfortable. Russell looked toward the leather couch. You should try to get some sleep. You too. I'll survive. I wasn't asking. That earned another one of those almost smiles. You've become surprisingly comfortable disagreeing with your boss. I'm off the clock. So you are. He disappeared for a minute and returned carrying one of the pillows from the executive office. You found pillows? I remembered where they were. Of course you did. I've apparently developed a reputation. You absolutely have. He tossed one toward me. You'll complain less tomorrow. I wasn't complaining. You were thinking about it. I laughed. I hate that you're probably right. We arranged the blankets across the couch and the armchair. There wasn't really a graceful way to sleep in an office lounge. Russell chose the armchair. You'll be more comfortable on the couch. You don't have to. I'm taller. I noticed. The chair makes more sense. I knew better than to argue. For several minutes neither of us moved. The room was quiet except for the wind outside. Then Russell spoke into the darkness. Dean. Yeah? Thank you. I looked over. For what? For making tonight less miserable. I smiled before I could stop myself. I was thinking the same thing. Silence. Then. I've had worse business trips. I've definitely had worse Thursdays. That soft laugh again. It was becoming familiar. Comforting, even. I closed my eyes. I never would have guessed we'd spend this much time talking. Russell's answer came after a long pause. I don't usually. I noticed. I imagine you did. Another pause. Then, quietly. I forgot what it was like. What? To have a conversation that wasn't leading to a decision. I opened my eyes again. The emergency lighting painted the room in soft amber shadows. Russell wasn't looking at me. He was staring toward the ceiling. My days are mostly meetings. He spoke almost as if he were thinking out loud. Budgets. Deadlines. Performance reviews. You like your work? I do. But? He let out a slow breath. But somewhere along the way. He searched for the words. I stopped talking to people. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked, when was your last vacation? He actually thought about it. 3 years. I sat upright. Russell. What? That's terrible. It wasn't intentional. It never is. A small smile crossed his face. I suppose not. You need one. I have responsibilities. So does everyone. He looked over at me. I wasn't expecting career advice. I'm giving life advice. And you're qualified? No. I grinned. But someone has to. He laughed again. Longer this time. Not restrained. Not careful. Just honest. When it faded, he shook his head. I don't think anyone has spoken to me like this in years. Maybe they should. Maybe. His expression softened. They probably assume I don't want them to. Do you? He didn't answer right away. Finally. I don't know anymore. The honesty in that sentence lingered. I realized something that hadn't occurred to me before. Russell spent every day surrounded by people. Yet somehow, he still sounded lonely. Not because he lacked company. Because everyone always needed something from him. Approval. Decisions. Answers. Nobody simply talked to him. The thought made my chest tighten unexpectedly. Without thinking, I said, You know. He looked over. I don't think you're difficult to talk to. He held my gaze. No. No. I think people decide who you are before they ever meet you. He looked away again. Including you? I smiled sheepishly. There. What did you decide? I hesitated. Honestly? I asked. I thought you were intimidating. I am. You are. I laughed. But I also thought. I searched for the right words. That you didn't really care about anyone. The room became very still. Russell didn't seem offended. Only thoughtful. And now? I looked at him. Now without the suit jacket. Without the conference room. Without the office between us. I think you care too much. His eyes stayed on mine. Neither of us looked away. For what felt like a very long time. There was only silence. Finally, Russell spoke. That's a dangerous observation. Why? Because if people know what matters to you. He smiled faintly. They know how to hurt you. The sentence landed heavily. Not because it was dramatic. Because it sounded learned. Like experience. Not theory. I wanted to ask what had happened. Who had taught him that? But something told me tonight wasn't the right moment. Instead, I simply said, I'm glad I was wrong. He tilted his head. About what? About you. For the first time that night. Russell looked genuinely caught off guard. He lowered his eyes for a second before quietly answering. I'm glad too. Outside, the storm continued without mercy. Inside, neither of us noticed that almost 4 hours had passed since we'd intended to go to sleep. We were no longer just passing time until the roads reopened. Somewhere between coffee, silence, and conversations either of us had expected to have. Two strangers who happened to work in the same office had begun seeing each other as something entirely different. And although either of us was ready to admit it yet, I had started wishing the morning wouldn't come quite so soon. I must have fallen asleep eventually. Not for long. When I opened my eyes, the room was still dim, washed in the soft amber glow of the emergency lights. For a second, I had no idea where I was. Then I heard the wind. The storm. The office. Russell. I sat up slowly. The digital clock on the wall read 5:42 a.m. Outside, darkness was beginning to soften into the pale blue that comes just before sunrise. Russell was awake. Of course he was. He stood near the window with another cup of coffee, his silhouette outlined against the endless white outside. You've been awake long? I asked, my voice rough from sleep. A while. You should have woken me. You looked like you needed the rest. I stretched, every muscle protesting. I probably did. He turned toward me. Coffee? Please. By the time I joined him at the window, he'd already poured another cup. Still no signal? He glanced at his phone. Nothing. I checked mine anyway. The same result. No messages. No emails. I smiled. The world's surviving without us. I'm not convinced. That earned a quiet laugh. We stood side by side, watching the first lights spread across the city. Or what we could see of it. Snowdrifts had transformed everything into smooth white shapes. Cars looked like oversized snowbanks. Trees had almost disappeared beneath layers of ice. It really is beautiful, I said. It is. I don't think I've ever seen anything like this. Russell nodded. The day after a storm always feels different. How? Quieter. He looked out across the frozen city. As though everyone remembers how small they are. I looked at him. That's unexpectedly poetic. I'd appreciate it if you kept that observation to yourself. I laughed. So there is a poet hiding under the spreadsheets. I wouldn't go that far. I definitely would. He shook his head with quiet amusement. I've made a mistake. Oh? I've encouraged you. You absolutely have. For the first time since we met, teasing him felt easy. Natural. That realization should have worried me more than it did. Around 6:30, the building's internet finally flickered back to life. A moment later, Our phones buzzed almost simultaneously. Signal. Dozens of notifications poured in. Missed calls. Emergency alerts. Messages from coworkers. Russell looked at his screen for several seconds before locking it again. "You've got work already?" "I have 23 emails." I grimaced. "I have 9. You win." "I don't think that's winning." "No." He slipped his phone back into his pocket. "It isn't." The spell broke a little after that. Reality had found us again. The office slowly stopped feeling like our temporary refuge and started becoming work. We both noticed it. Neither of us said anything. About an hour later, security came upstairs carrying good news. The cities started clearing roads. "How long?" Russell asked. "Another hour or two." I should have been relieved. Instead, something unexpectedly heavy settled in my chest. Soon we'd leave. Go back to conference rooms. Deadlines. Titles. He'd become my boss again. I'd become another employee. The strange little world we'd shared overnight would disappear. Russell thanked the security guard, and once we were alone again, he looked out the window. "Looks like our adventure's ending." "Adventure?" I smiled at the word. "I guess it is." He nodded. For several moments, neither of us moved. Then he surprised me. "I've enjoyed your company." It wasn't a formal sentence. It wasn't office language. It sounded personal. Honest. "I've enjoyed yours too." His eyes met mine. "I'm glad." The words were simple. But somehow they carried more weight than they should have. Around 8:30, facilities announced that employees could begin leaving carefully. Russell gathered the blankets we'd used and folded them with the same precision he seemed to apply to everything else. I helped. When we finished, we stood near the lounge door, either of us quite ready to walk out. It felt oddly similar to saying goodbye after spending a weekend with an old friend. Which made absolutely no sense. We'd known each other for months. Worked together almost every day. And yet, I somehow felt like I'd met the real Russell only 12 hours earlier. He adjusted his coat. "You'll drive carefully." It wasn't phrased as a question. "I will." "The roads are still dangerous." "I know." Another pause. Then he smiled. A real one this time. Small. Warm. The kind of smile I'd been convinced he wasn't capable of. "I'm expecting you in the office on Monday." I laughed. "So this wasn't enough to earn me the week off?" "Not even close." "I had to try." "You did." We walked toward the elevators together. The lobby looked brighter than it had the night before. Outside, snowplows crawled through the streets. The city was waking up. Slowly. Carefully. Everything felt new. The elevator doors opened. We stepped inside. For the first time since the storm had begun. There were other people around. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Russell straightened his posture. Not dramatically. Just enough that I recognized the familiar executive everyone at work knew. I felt it too. Without thinking, I slipped back into employee mode. The elevator descended in silence. When the doors opened into the lobby, several coworkers rushed toward Russell. "There you are! We've been trying to reach you all night. Operations needs approval on." He answered calmly, professionally, effortlessly. The walls were back. Just like that. I quietly stepped aside, figuring this was where our strange little overnight friendship ended. Then, before I could disappear into the crowd, "Dean!" I turned. Russell was already answering another question, but he looked toward me for just a moment. "Get home safely." Nothing more. Just 4 words. Simple. Professional enough that nobody else thought twice about them. But I knew. Because the way he said them wasn't the way a manager dismissed an employee. It was the way someone spoke to a person they genuinely wanted to see again. And somehow, that mattered far more than I was prepared to admit. The drive home should have been all I thought about. The roads were barely visible beneath packed snow, traffic crawled along at walking speed, and every bridge looked like something you'd rather avoid. Instead, I kept thinking about Russell. Not my boss. The man who'd admitted he hadn't taken a vacation in 3 years. Who remembered that I'd straightened magazines before my interview. Who laughed quietly when nobody expected him to. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted. I kicked off my boots, dropped my overnight bag by the door, and stood in complete silence. It felt strange. After spending nearly 20 hours talking to someone almost nonstop, the apartment seemed too quiet. I made breakfast around noon. Forgot to eat it. Collapsed into bed instead. When I woke up, it was already evening. My phone buzzed. A message from Melissa in accounting. Did you survive? I smiled. Barely. Was Russell impossible? I stared at the screen. How was I supposed to answer that? Because the truthful answer sounded ridiculous. No. He'd been thoughtful. Funny. Kind. Human. Instead, I typed. He wasn't as bad as everyone thinks. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Seriously? Seriously. Another pause. You're literally the first person who's ever said that. I didn't know what to make of that. Monday arrived much faster than I wanted. Walking back into the office felt oddly surreal. Everything looked exactly the same. People hurried between meetings. Printers hummed. Coffee smelled burnt. Someone complained about the parking garage. Normal. Completely normal. As if the storm had never happened. As if Russell and I hadn't spent an entire night talking until sunrise. Melissa spotted me first. There he is! She leaned over her cubicle wall. The survivor. I laughed. I feel dramatic being called that. You were trapped with Russell. She lowered her voice dramatically. That's surviving. I smiled despite myself. He's really not that scary. She stared. Dean. What? You've changed. What does that mean? You smiled. So? You smiled because someone mentioned Russell. I immediately looked away. I did not. You absolutely did. Before I could defend myself, my inbox chimed. Meeting 9 a.m. Conference room A. Organizer. Russell. My stomach tightened. Not because I was nervous. Because I suddenly had no idea how we were supposed to act around each other. Conference room A slowly filled with department heads and project leads. I took my usual seat near the middle. Russell entered exactly on time. Dark suit. Tie perfectly straight. Professional. Composed. If I hadn't spent the weekend with him, I'd have believed this was the only version of him that existed. He began the meeting immediately. Let's get started. For the next 45 minutes, everything felt normal. Budgets. Timelines. Client updates. He was calm. Focused. Exactly the manager everyone expected. I started wondering if I'd imagined the entire weekend. Maybe the storm had simply created an illusion. Maybe things really would go back to normal. Then the meeting ended. People gathered their laptops and filed toward the door. I packed my notebook slowly, waiting for the room to empty. As I reached the exit, Dean! His voice was quiet. Professional. I need a minute. My heart immediately sped up. Everyone else left. The door closed. Silence. Russell looked down at the papers in front of him for a second before meeting my eyes. I wanted to thank you again. I blinked. You already did. I know. He folded his hands together. I wasn't sure if I'd have another opportunity. I smiled. I should probably be thanking you. For what? You made being trapped in an office surprisingly enjoyable. That familiar smile appeared. Brief. Private. Gone before anyone else could have noticed. I've been informed that isn't usually my reputation. I think your reputation needs updating. I doubt the office would believe you. They definitely wouldn't. For a moment, it felt exactly like the lounge during the storm. Easy. Comfortable. Then footsteps echoed outside. Almost instantly, The walls returned. Russell straightened another report. I'll see you at Thursday's client presentation. Professional again. Boss again. I nodded. Of course. I reached the door. My hand was already on the handle when he spoke once more. Without looking up. Dean. Yeah? I'm glad the road's reopened. I frowned slightly. Me too. A tiny pause. Mostly. I looked at him. He finally lifted his eyes. There it was. The same expression I'd seen standing beside the window while the city disappeared beneath the snow. Quiet. Honest. He wasn't talking about the roads. He was saying he was glad we were safe, but not entirely glad that the night had ended. I smiled before I could stop myself. Mostly. His answering smile was almost invisible. But it was enough. When I stepped back into the hallway, Melissa looked up from her desk. What was that about? I shook my head. Work. She narrowed her eyes. You sure? I hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second. Yeah. Technically. It wasn't a lie. After all, Russell was still my boss. Whatever had happened during the storm stayed exactly where it had begun. Inside an office building buried beneath snow. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I just wasn't entirely sure I believed it anymore. For the next few days, I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. It was easier that way. People act differently in unusual situations. A blizzard. An empty office. No phones. No deadlines. No escape. Anyone would become more open under those circumstances. That was the explanation I repeated every morning while making coffee. It sounded reasonable. The problem was, Russell kept quietly ruining it. Not with grand gestures. Nothing that anyone else would notice. Just little things. On Tuesday morning I arrived carrying 2 coffees after stopping at the cafe downstairs. One for me. One because I'd accidentally ordered the wrong size. As I passed Russell's office, his door was open. He looked up. Morning. Morning. I kept walking. Then his voice stopped me. Dean. I turned. He glanced toward the extra coffee in my hand. You bought 2. I looked down. Oh. I laughed awkwardly. One's an accident. I see. There was a tiny pause. If it's going to waste. I smiled. You want it? I rarely decline coffee. I walked into his office and handed it over. Careful. It's dangerously average. I've survived worse. Again. That dry humor. Hidden where almost nobody ever saw it. He accepted the cup with a quiet thank you. As I turned to leave, he added, I'll return the favor. You don't have to. I know. His expression softened just slightly. I'd like to. It shouldn't have stayed in my thoughts all day. But it did. Thursday arrived with the Carson client presentation. The same proposal we'd reviewed together before the storm. I was setting up the projector when Russell entered the conference room. Everything about him was professional again. Confident. Collected. He greeted the clients. Introduced the agenda. Then looked toward me. Dean will walk us through the revised numbers. I froze for half a second. He never volunteered me to lead part of a presentation before. Not once. I stood. Managed to keep my voice steady. Presented 20 minutes of financial projections without tripping over my own words. When the meeting finally ended, the clients seemed genuinely impressed. One of them even shook my hand. Excellent presentation. Thank you. After everyone left, I started gathering cables. Russell remained at the table, organizing his notes. Without looking up, he said, You were ready. I hoped so. You didn't hope. He closed the folder. You prepared. I looked at him. There's a difference. There it was again. Praise. Quiet. Specific. Real. I learned from a good manager. He looked up slowly. I'll accept that. Then, after the briefest pause. You've earned more responsibility. The words caught me completely off guard. You mean? I mean exactly what I said. He stood. I'll discuss it with HR next week. I stared after him as he left the room. Melissa wandered in 30 seconds later. Why do you look like someone just told you aliens exist? I blinked. I think I just got promoted. What? I think. She frowned. Russell promoted you? I don't know if it's official. She folded her arms. Dean. What? He doesn't do that. What? Recommend people after 8 months. I looked toward the hallway where Russell had disappeared. He apparently does now. Melissa studied my face. You two are weird. We're not weird. You've been different since the snowstorm. I have not. You smile more. I smile. Not at work. I couldn't argue with that. Because she was right. Friday evening arrived faster than expected. Most people rushed toward the elevators the second 5 o'clock arrived. I was packing my laptop when someone stopped beside my desk. Russell. You heading home? I looked up. Yeah. So am I. I waited. He almost looked uncertain. Something I'd only seen once before. During the storm. The cafe across the street reopened today. I nodded. I heard. Another brief silence. Then. They finally fixed the espresso machine. I smiled. Good for them. He looked at me for another second. As though deciding whether to continue. Finally. If you're not in a hurry. He adjusted the strap of his laptop bag. Would you like to get a coffee? Time seemed to stop. Not because of the invitation. Because he asked it so carefully. Not as my boss. Not as someone giving instructions. As a man who genuinely wasn't sure what my answer would be. I searched his face. There was no pressure. No expectation. Just quiet hope. I felt my heart beating much faster than seemed reasonable. I smiled. I'd like that. Something warm appeared in his expression. Not relief exactly. But close. Good. We walked toward the elevators together. Not touching. Not speaking much. Just two people leaving work on a Friday evening. Except. Nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. Because somewhere between being snowed in, sharing coffee at sunrise, and learning who Russell really was behind the office door, this had quietly stopped feeling like two coworkers spending time together. Neither of us had said it. Neither of us was ready to. But as we stepped out into the crisp winter air side by side, I realized something that made my pulse quicken. I wasn't looking forward to the coffee. I was looking forward to simply spending another hour with him. And somehow, that felt far more dangerous than anything the blizzard had thrown at us. The cafe was almost empty. Most people were still digging themselves out after the storm, and the streets outside looked quieter than usual. Snow remained piled along the sidewalks, sparkling beneath the streetlights. Russell held the door open for me. After you? Thanks. We found a table by the window. For a moment neither of us spoke. It felt different now. There was no emergency. No blizzard keeping us together. Either of us could have gone home. Instead, we had both chosen to be here. The waitress brought 2 coffees before asking if we wanted anything to eat. Russell looked at me. I skipped lunch. So did I. I suspected as much. We ordered something simple and watched the snow drift outside. Finally, Russell broke the silence. I've been thinking about that night. I smiled. So have I. I wasn't sure whether I should ask you here. Why not? He wrapped both hands around his mug. Because I'm your manager. There it was. The one thing neither of us had said out loud. I know. I've spent a week asking myself whether I was confusing unusual circumstances with something else. And? He looked directly at me. I don't think I was. My heart skipped. I don't either. The words hung between us. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Russell gave a small, thoughtful smile. I appreciate your honesty. I figured we deserved that much. We do. He nodded slowly. But honesty also means acknowledging reality. I already knew what he meant. The company. My position. He sighed quietly. I won't put either of us in a situation that could be unfair. I wouldn't want that either. For the first time that evening, I saw uncertainty return to his face. So, I smiled gently. What happens now? He considered the question for several seconds. I've already been interviewing for another role. I blinked. You have? It started before the storm. I had no idea. Very few people do. He looked out the window. The board has been encouraging me to move into a regional strategy position. That sounds big. It would also mean I wouldn't manage this office anymore. I stared at him. When? If everything goes according to plan. He smiled softly. About 6 weeks. A strange mix of relief and disappointment settled over me. 6 weeks suddenly sounded both incredibly close and impossibly far away. Russell seemed to read my expression. I'm not asking you to wait. I know. I'm asking if, once we're no longer in that professional relationship. He paused. You'd let me take you to dinner. Not coffee. Dinner. A real beginning. I couldn't stop smiling. I'd like that. His shoulders relaxed in a way I'd never seen before. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to realize how tense he'd been waiting for my answer. I was hoping you'd say that. Over the following weeks, nothing inappropriate happened. At work, Russell remained exactly what he'd always been. Professional. Fair. Demanding. No favorites. No private conversations behind closed doors. If anything, he became even more careful than before. I respected him for that. It reminded me that the man I'd met during the storm wasn't different from the manager everyone saw every day. He simply had another side that very few people were ever allowed to know. The office eventually announced his promotion. There was applause. Congratulations. A farewell lunch. Melissa leaned toward me during the celebration. I still can't believe he's leaving. He'll do well. She smiled. I think he'll finally take a vacation. I laughed. I hope so. She looked at me curiously. You know. What? You seem weirdly confident about that. I smiled into my coffee. I've got a feeling. His final day arrived on a bright Friday morning. By afternoon, his office was almost empty. A few framed photos. One cardboard box. His favorite coffee mug. That was all. As everyone gathered to say goodbye, Russell thanked the team for their work over the years. His speech was brief. Sincere. Exactly like him. When people slowly drifted back to their desks, I found myself lingering near the elevators. He walked over carrying the last box. I believe. He smiled. I owe you dinner. You do. Tomorrow? I'd like that. Neither of us cared that the conversation lasted less than a minute. Because now, there was nothing to hide. The next evening, we met at a small restaurant overlooking the river. No office. No titles. No employees walking past. Just Russell. Just me. Conversation came as naturally as it had during the snowstorm. We talked for hours. About books. Family. Travel. Dreams we'd postponed for too long. At one point he laughed and shook his head. It's strange. What is? I spent months thinking you were simply one of my brightest employees. And now? Now I can't imagine not knowing you. I smiled. I almost never spoke to you before that storm. I know. You were intimidating. I've heard. You still are. He laughed. But now I know what's behind it. And what's that? A good man. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Russell reached across the table and, after a brief, questioning glance that gave me every opportunity to pull away, gently took my hand. I smiled. I was wondering how long that would take. So was I. We both laughed. Not because anything extraordinary had happened. Because everything felt wonderfully ordinary. Months later, people at the office still talked about the historic blizzard that had trapped 2 employees overnight. Most remembered the weather. The power outages. The impossible drive home. Whenever someone mentioned it, I'd smile quietly. Because they only knew half the story. They remembered the storm that buried an office building beneath snow. I remembered the night 2 people stopped being a boss and an employee. The night conversation replaced assumptions. The night silence became comfortable. The night I discovered that the quietest man I'd ever met had simply been waiting for someone willing to see beyond the title on his office door. Sometimes life changes because of a carefully planned decision. Sometimes it changes because a blizzard closes every road in the city. Looking back, I no longer think we were trapped in that building. I think we were given something far rarer. Time. Time to listen. Time to understand. Time to meet each other without the noise of everyday life. And every winter, when the first heavy snow begins to fall, Russell still looks out the window with the same thoughtful expression he had that night. Then he smiles at me and says the words that always make me laugh. "Looks like another storm." And every single time, I answer exactly the same way. Hopefully not quite that memorable. He smiles. We'll never know. Maybe we won't. But I do know one thing. The greatest change in my life didn't arrive with sunshine. It arrived quietly. Hidden inside a snowstorm.